All right, welcome. My name is Wes. I am one of the co-leads co-chairs for the communications work group. And normally every month we'll host a virtual networking and learning session centered around different topics that come up. And we are very excited to bring up climate health. It is a very crucial and pressing issue today. And today I'm excited to introduce Dr. Lanza, who's an assistant professor in environmental and occupational health sciences and epidemiology at UT Health School of Public Health. Dr. Lanza received his PhD in city and regional planning from Georgia Institute of Technology and completed his postdoctoral training at the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living at the UT Health in Austin. In his research, Dr. Lanza explores the relationship between the environment, health behaviors, and health through the lens of climate equity. His primary aims are to determine the impact of extreme heat on physical activity, exertional heat illness, and chronic diseases of individuals living in low-income communities and communities of color, and to develop interventions, behavioral, programmatic, and environmental, to improve community resilience. Ultimately, his research goal is to inform policies that eliminate race, ethnicity, and class-based health inequities in the face of warming from urbanization and climate change. Dr. Lance acknowledges that authentic partnership with community members is essential for health and climate solutions to be truly effective. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Lance.
Thank you, Wes. I really appreciate it. And I should probably minimize that bio. It's kind of long. So I'll share my screen now, if that's okay. Let's see. And then if I could just get someone to tell me if they see, is the PowerPoint on and working all right?
Yep.
All right. Okay, great. Well, thank you for having me. This is my first convening with the Health Equity Collective. So I'm excited to be here and appreciate you building the space to listen in. And so this talk today on climate health, and I'm going to speak specifically about extreme heat and its impacts on health equity. And this will be specific, all of this research to Texas. Most of these studies are in Austin and Houston. And so here are some images of Houston and different ways people experience the heat through their different identities. And so here's kind of the overview of the talk. I believe this will be more or less around 35 to 40 minutes. And then it will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you think of any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, or we can just talk about them after. I'll first begin with an introduction around the relations between heat, health, and social equity. Then I'll move into 5 different research projects around the community experience with heat, how temperatures affect trail use, heat-resilient bus transit systems, and then green schoolyards, and then lastly, school routes and how we can manage heat along those routes. So kind of some table setting first. We've understood that average global temperatures have increased over time. Here are data across the full year, across the entire world. These are global land and ocean temperatures, air temperatures. And what we can see is these are differences from the 20th century average of temperatures. And that 20th century average of temperatures is 57 degrees Fahrenheit. So anywhere between 1880 to around 1940, each year is cooler than the 20th century at large. Yet once you reach around 1980 and beyond, that's when every year has been hotter than the 20th century average. This is showing our global warming. The last 10 years have been the hottest ever recorded. 2023 was the hottest year ever. And we've had the hottest day ever back on July 22nd of this year. Not only are average global temperatures increasing with time, but we're also seeing an increase in what are called heat waves or extreme heat events. These are, at a most general definition, 2 or more days continuously of abnormally high temperatures. So over time in the United States, we've seen an increase in how often these heat waves are happening, these extreme heat events, how long they're lasting, the season as to when they can happen, and then how hot they are, their intensity. So that's the past to the present. And now what are we seeing moving forward? Our climate models are showing that extreme heat days are increasing under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So whatever's happening across the world in terms of policies to curb global greenhouse gas emissions and enhance our carbon sinks that sequester or take in the carbon from the atmosphere, we're seeing that in Harris County, specifically these data are from, the number of days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or hot days, is increasing over time under the two emission scenarios. The yellow line shows an intermediate scenario where global greenhouse gas emissions continue increasing to about the year 2040, at which policies have led to a stifling or great reduction in these greenhouse gas emissions. And then a high emission scenario where emissions continue, where policy is not checking them. And what you can see is that in Harris County, currently, there's around 45 days a year above 95 Fahrenheit. Yet towards the end of the century, under these different scenarios, it's going to be quite a large change based on how much we emit into our atmosphere. So what does this mean for human health? Here is a conceptual framework from the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and it shows in the middle ring the major climate change impacts, including rising temperatures. In the middle ring, it shows how these impacts influence different exposures, including extreme heat. And in the outer portion, it shows how these exposures affect different health-related outcomes. I've highlighted in red here the portion we're focusing on in this study and the climate and health component of interest, and extreme heat and how it affects heat-related illness and death and cardiovascular disease. One thing to note is that these are the far ends of this health spectrum in the sense of what kind of injury or potential death can happen from extreme heat. Yet in my research, I also add some potential effects of extreme heat on human health and well-being. So why are people focusing on heat in relation to health? Well, it's the most deadly weather-related hazard in the United States. Here are data across the past 30 years, the average of the number of weather-related fatalities across different weather-related hazards. You can see heat has quite a bit more than the other hazards, and this is grossly underreported. These are based on death certificates where the medical examiner identifies heat as the main cause or a contributing cause of death, but that's a relatively subjective call, and it's not standardized across our different counties. And so we think these numbers are very, very low compared to what they actually are. So in terms of physical activity, we know that in the US, we are in a physical inactivity crisis, where only half of all US adults are reaching the National Physical Activity Guidelines for health and well-being. And more alarming is only about a quarter of children are reaching these guidelines for aerobic activity. We know that physical activity improves mood, helps sleep, lowers the risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancers, and oftentimes what one learns in childhood tracks into adulthood in terms of activity levels. So kind of continuing with the children population, we're seeing that in Texas, data collected from the Michael and Susan Dell Center for Healthy Living as part of the Texas School Physical Activity and Nutrition Survey shows that amongst Texas fourth graders, most fourth graders are not reaching recommended levels of physical activity, yet there are differences by race and ethnicity. So this is the health disparity. So that begs the question, we know Texas is hot. It's a warm climate. It's only getting hotter. Is extreme heat serving as a barrier to children engaging in activity because of thermal discomfort? So here's where we kind of start looking at what we've done in terms of research. We've seen that not only are cities or places warming in terms of average temperatures, and we're seeing an increase in extreme heat events or heat waves, but cities also have higher temperatures than other regions. And this is because of a phenomenon called the urban heat island effect. This is driven by four major factors. It's high amounts of dark building materials that absorb incoming radiation and re-emit it as heat. Second, it is lack or loss of tree canopy, which cools the surface and the air through shading and evapotranspiration, which is the evaporation of water from plant leaves. Third, it's waste heat emissions from driving our cars, using our air conditioning. And then lastly, it's the urban form or morphology. It's kind of the design and the height of the buildings and the narrowness of the streets. And so what we did in Austin, and has also been done in Houston and dozens of other cities in the US, is a community science mapping campaign where citizens in Austin drove their personal vehicles with a device that you see in this picture that measures air temperature, relative humidity, and the geographic location through a GPS device every 1 second. And then from those data where we drove, we then estimated temperatures between where we drove to create this spatially continuous map you see on the right-hand side. And this is only for half of Austin. But what you can see is there's a large difference in in temperatures, about a 6-degree air temperature difference between the coolest spot and the hottest spot on the same time of day. And that's that urban heat island intensity that's independent of climate change. The northwest portion of this map is the hottest spot in Austin, and that is a low-income Latino neighborhood. So showcasing the inequitable distribution of heat in time and space. So what did we do with those quantitative data? Well, we complemented it with qualitative data. In that northwest portion, that was the hottest spot in the city, we explored the heat vulnerability and recommended adaptation responses from those residents that are living there. What we did was we ended up recruiting 18 adults, most of which were female and Latino, and 14 of these interviews were conducted in Spanish. It was a rather simple interview script. Imagine it's 105 degrees outside. What does your day look like? What do you see in your community that would make it feel cooler? And is there anything else you'd like to share? Then from the community voice as the data, we then sifted through the data to think and consider if any themes, any recurring patterns happened through that data. And we did that through a software called NVivo. So here are the 6 themes that we found from that thematic analysis. First, heat impacted their physical health. It impacted their mental health, their physical activity, and their social relationships. The exposure to heat, so when they're in contact with heat, whether indoors, outdoors, wherever, they mentioned mostly was during active transportation, so using the bus, because 2/3 of the US walks to get to and from the bus stop or station, participating in outdoor work, either at the home or for their employment, and then recreation, playing outside with their children. Heat sensitivity, so that's the degree to which an individual is impacted by heat or any other environmental stressor. They always mention children. Every single adult mentioned children are those infected, and those with existing medical conditions, often hypertension, diabetes. Adaptive capacity, that's the ability on an individual level to cope with these temperatures. People said that they stayed home, they drank liquids, they changed their daily schedules, and they use air conditioning. Everyone said using AC. Barriers to adjusting to heat in the environment was lack of trees, there was no shade, there was no green space like parks, and then they also mentioned no blue spaces, such as natural water bodies or pools they could go to. And then kind of the converse of that is what strategies would they like to see? They mentioned more trees, shade structures, green space, blue space, and drinking fountains to rehydrate. So along with those themes, I want to share some quotes that I think respond well to each of those given themes from the community members. So heat impacts us. I get more stressed, I get more tired. I don't feel like going for a walk to de-stress. We take shelter in the house, hoping that the air will keep us cool. It hits us hard because stressed children are also locked in. So you can see here how heat makes them feel like they can't go outside. It affects their mental health. They feel physically exhausted. And then they can't even go out to de-stress doing what they like to do. And they use some pretty charged language, locked in. I like to be able to go outside and kind of walk around, but there are not a lot of green areas around my neighborhood, so I have to stay indoors. Sometimes my son wants to come walking, but I tell him, no, son, you have to take the bus. You're already walking a little bit and it's really hot. Oops, sorry. Heat affects me too much because my husband comes home tired, not in the mood to play with the girls. This shows that heat is a family affair where it affects the wife in this quote. And we know that from the rest of the interview, her husband is an outdoor construction worker. So he's getting exposed to heat while engaging in physical exertion. And then when he comes home, the family dynamic is getting messed up because he's not in the mood to play with his children. So then some last quotes from these interviews. Sometimes bus stops are very far away and don't have shade to look forward to. The buses were very late. If you miss one, you have to wait for the other, 30 or 40 minutes depending on the route. So here we see a lot of issues with heat and transit use. One is the bus stops are very far away, and we know that people mostly walk to get to the bus stop. So that's a long dose of heat. There's no shade once you get to that intermediate destination, so people can't cool off once they're at the bus stop. The buses are late, so that means you're continue to be exposed to this high temperature. And if you miss one, you have to wait 30 or 40 minutes. That's getting at the headway or how often buses are coming, and that's continued exposure to the heat. You can't go to the river because all the people settle there. We don't even have a pool where we can go or parks that have a splash pad where the kids can play. that gets at these blue space strategies. At least it's going to feel a little cooler if we have more trees and there are parks with water fountains for the children to play and all that. And let's say roofs so that they can be under a roof and not practically under the sun. So here they showcase water fountains for hydration, trees for their canopy and their shading, as well as artificial shade structures. I guess you can't do anything against the weather. I cannot even imagine a solution for the heat. It seems like nobody's smart enough to know exactly what to do. Well, we're trying, and I think we're trying together. So now pivoting to the next study, this is looking at the relations between temperature and trail use. And I wonder if any folks here recognize these images. These are from the Ann and Roy Butler Hike and Bike Trail in Austin, Texas. This is a 10-mile loop trail, just shown in the top right image through the red line. And it is continuous. There's around 5 million users every single year. And so what we have along the trail are these 5 eco-counter urban multis. These are these laser-based devices that you see on the bottom right image. It's inside that little pole, that gray pole. And it can actually measure the hourly counts of pedestrians and hourly counts of cyclists that pass by. And so that's how we know there's over 5 million users every year. So what we did with those hourly data is we then looked at how it associated with hourly temperature data from the nearest weather station, along with precipitation data. And then we used regression modeling to understand if there's a relationship between temperature and trail use of both pedestrians and cyclists. Along with seeing what was the observed temperature and trail use across the full year of 2019, we also leveraged publicly available data from NASA that showcases temperature, average daily maximum temperature and rainfall for 2 different greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So we wanted to see and estimate how future temperatures would impact trail use. And so we looked at both current time, which was the 2006 to 2025 period, a mid-century time, and then an end-of-century time. And so we were able to understand how future temperatures would potentially impact trail use through combining whatever relationship we saw from the observed trail use and temperatures, which we collected from those sensors, and then combining those with these daily projections. So what did we find? We found that this is the observed data I'm showing here. Temperature extremes were associated with lower trail use. And so this is looking at apparent temperature, which is a combination term for air temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed, which gets at, is a type of heat stress metric. And so what you see here are these risk ratios for pedestrians and cyclists. So anytime this curve is above 1, that's when individuals, either pedestrians or cyclists, were more likely to use the trail. So for pedestrians, they were more likely to use the trail between 40 degrees and 85 degrees, while cyclists liked it a little hotter, around 55, 60 degrees to almost about 100 degrees. So we think that pedestrians on the cooler end were more likely to use the trail because they could always wear more clothes, they can bundle up, while cyclists, they create wind while they're riding, and that may make it too cool. And so they'd rather maybe walk or take another mode. Conversely, on the hotter end, pedestrians may prefer cooler temperatures because they can only take off so much clothes legally. And then cyclists can create their own wind, and they can get to destinations quicker than pedestrians. Now, here are the projected data, and I just showcase here the difference between current time and mid-century, and I just showcase under the intermediate greenhouse gas emission scenario, which is the more likely scenario based on our current projections of warming. And so if you look at the 2 columns, the black and blue columns on the most left-hand side, the full year, you can see that there's an overall net decrease in trail use with projected climate change. What's interesting is that during the cooler months, like January, February, and March, you actually see an increase in trail use. And that makes sense because you're getting temperatures in the more comfortable zone. But then during the hot months, you're seeing a large decrease in both pedestrians and cyclist use of the trail. Okay, shifting gears again to our next study. This is looking at our public transit system in Austin again. So that was the past study. We're looking at Austin again here. And the question is, do bus stop shelters, so those artificial shade structures at bus stops and trees around bus stops, do they impact the effect of extreme heat on how many people use the bus? And so here are two different bus stops in Austin. These used to be part of my daily commute. On the left-hand side, yes, that is a bus stop. There's a sign, there's a trash can, there's a bench. On the right-hand side, that's also a couple bus stops. And you can see the bench, the sign, the trash can again. But this time you also see two artificial shade structures. You also see tree canopy, and importantly, you see people. So this study took place across the full bus system in Austin during the warm season, April to September 2019. The variable that we looked at as the outcome was the total daily number of boardings from 1 to 6 p.m. per bus stop. And so 1 to 6 p.m. being the hottest time of the day. Our exposure variables or independent variables of interest were daily maximum air temperature, what we defined as a hot day being 97 degrees or above, whether or not there was a bus stop shelter, and then tree canopy surrounding each bus stop, the percentage of it. And so we define that last variable on the right-hand side, just walking you through it. That blue dot is the bus stop itself. And we drew I think it was like a 50-meter Euclidean buffer, so a radius line at a distance from that blue bus stop point to draw a circle. And that's the distance as to what we thought was reasonable for someone to walk away from the bus stop, but still be able to catch their bus to seek shade. We clipped that circle based on if it crossed a road, which you can see in the top right image, because we didn't think people would be crossing the road to seek shade. We also clipped that circle if it included any buildings, because we didn't expect buildings to necessarily be open for individuals to use. And so what we found from regression modeling is that temperatures exhibited a negative association with ridership. So the hotter it got, the less riders there were, meaning that maybe it was too thermally uncomfortable to take the bus. We also saw that trees at bus stops, but not shelters, had a protective effect on ridership on hot days. This is not necessarily canceling the idea of having bus stop shelters, because it more so might get at that trees are more effective than bus stop shelters, yet it probably gets at the population using the bus system in Austin, which we know is majority low income. And so there could be a situation where using the bus is an inelastic thing. They have to be using the bus. So having a shelter there or not doesn't necessarily affect ridership numbers, but we do know affects thermal comfort. So here is a viral moment through X, or formerly Twitter, where the Capital Metro had a image of the old bus stop shelter and the replacement shelter. And this is quite a charged image, and the public let Capital Metro know. In the top image, you see the old shelter. It's heavily shaded, it's large. And the bottom, you see a sleek, modern design, yet you don't see much shade. So there was really a firestorm of critique of them posting this, saying, why did you remove our shade? And the Cap Metro has acknowledged that this maybe wasn't the best image to use because it was taken at different times of day. And so that's where you see the different shading. And here's a quote from one of the residents: "They don't got enough shade, take them back." Okay, so now we're moving on to Houston, Texas, still focused on the bus stop system. So based on that study we had done in Austin, I had the good fortune to talk to some reporters at Houston Public Media, and they actually led an experiment that measured heat stress under bus stop shelters, as we see here, versus outside of bus stop shelters, as well as under tree shade at bus stop shelters and outside of bus stop shelters, or outside of bus stops. So who rides the bus in Houston? We have over 49 million bus boardings in 2023. And here are some data from 2017 through a survey of residents in the Houston-Galveston area. We see that across the transit system, most people are using the local bus of the modes available. We see that the annual household income is, the median is around 33,000, so it's relatively lower income. The race ethnicity is majority minoritized racial ethnic groups, including African American and Hispanic Latino. When people are using the transit system, they're using it frequently. So a quarter use it 6 or 7 days a week, where half use it 5 days a week. And then how are people accessing the transit? And this kind of tracks with our national numbers that 79% are walking to get to or from the stops or stations. So this experiment happened over 21 bus stops in Houston, Texas during last summer, July to August 2023. And we measured temperatures at 11 to 2 p.m. and then another time period, 4 to 6 p.m. The heat stress metric we use, so air temperature is a heat stress metric, for instance, is called wet bulb globe temperature. This really gets a better sense of how it really feels outside because it's a combination term for air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and radiation. So when the sun's hitting you, that heats you up, and that's that radiation piece. We measured this through a wet bulb globe temperature monitor, and we averaged 3 measurements we took per location per stop. So in the bottom image, you see the sensor on a tripod, and that's us measuring it inside the bus shelter. We also measured shade areas outside the bus shelter when they were available, and then also under direct sunlight. So if there was a tree, we'd measure under tree canopy and then outside a tree canopy at a bus stop. On the top right, you see the general thresholds for WBGT. Houston is in region 3, so those are higher thresholds versus cooler regions, regions 1 and 2. And you can see just cut points of when it's considered a threat to human health. So what did we find? We found that wet bulb globe temperature was more than 2 times lower under tree shade than shelters at bus stops on average. So 5.6 WBGT versus 2.6 WBGT. So this is some evidence that perhaps we should be planting trees at bus stops rather than having shelters. What was really fascinating was that in 16% of cases, WBGT was higher under shelters than standing outside in direct sunlight at bus stops. So that is potentially showcasing maladaptation, where we have a situation where we're trying to improve our environment for health, yet it actually leads to a negative consequence. And so in the left-hand image, you see it was 6 degrees hotter under the bus stop shelter when it wasn't shaded. And we think this is because of these 3 walls that are enclosed that led to the bus stop shelter underneath it being more or less like a oven, where that radiation from the sun and the heat that was being emitted from materials was being trapped and heating up the people around it. And people felt it. You see this quote from a resident: "We look for shade nearby. We don't go inside the bus shelter because it feels steamy there." So what are recommendations from this? Well, tree planting is a big thing, not only at the bus stops, but also on those routes to get to the bus stops, because we know most people walk. You could also combine this with the shelter if the shelter is designed correctly. And then when the environment's not conducive to tree planting, like on the left-hand image in Houston, you could design shelters with heat in mind. So on the right hand, you see city of Tempe, Arizona, one of the hottest cities in the US. And what they've done is created a very large canopy on the top, and they've also created seating across underneath the canopy in different places that allows you to find shade independent of where the sun is. Another idea that I didn't focus on in my studies is water mist spraying system. So you see these water misters at theme parks, maybe patios, bars, restaurants, but where you don't see them often in the US are in municipal spaces, like at bus stop shelters. A literature review has shown that on average, these misting systems can decrease temperatures by 14 degrees Fahrenheit. So that makes a 100-degree day feel like 86, and these are often applied in Asia. Yet it is very important to understand the context. For instance, in Houston, we know it's very humid. And so adding water to the air, the water may not able to evaporate as quickly as in other settings. Shifting gears another time, we're focusing now on the Green Schoolyards project. This was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project where I partnered with the City of Austin to understand heat and its impact on children in elementary school parks. And what you can see in this image are 2 photos taken during data collection. The left hand, or I guess in both images, you see children, you see them under the shade in a school park. What you can't see is it was over 100 degrees Fahrenheit when this was taken. So in this project, we determined how green features, trees, gardens, nature trails at these elementary schools, how they impacted temperatures within the parks, the levels of physical activity of Latino children from low-income households, and how these children's connection to nature related to their social emotional learning skills. And these are skills, life skills, that allow you to thrive in the workplace, in your interactions with others, and just overall. So this project, these 3 elementary school parks, and these were serving majority 85% economically disadvantaged Latino households in Austin. And we focus on 2 weeks of September and 1 week in November because this is for comparison of a hotter temperature week during the school year versus a more mild week. And we measured children's physical activity during recess by having them wear these an accelerometer, this left-hand red device, and a GPS device that allowed us to capture their physical activity in time and space during recess. We measured the green features, these trees, etc., and the shade from something like a shade canopy over a basketball court by drawing these polygons within a geographic information system from high-resolution aerial imagery. And we measured temperature and relative humidity by installing 10 sensors per park across these 3 parks. And we aimed for even spatial distribution across the parks, as well as capturing different land covers, such as grass versus concrete, etc., and land uses, so playgrounds versus basketball courts, for instance. We measured children's psychological connection to nature through a survey, and we used the Connection to Nature Index, a validated tool with the psychometric properties ready for children. Here's one of those 16 items. It's on a 5-point Likert scale with smiley faces. And to get that ultimate score, you just average the values across those 16 items. Then we measured children's social emotional learning skills from a survey that was already given annually by the school district with 10 items in it. And here's one of those 4 items, or one of those items on a 4-point Likert scale. And each of these 10 items did get at these different categories of social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, relationship skills, social awareness, and responsible decision-making. So from those sensors we placed at each school park, we were able to showcase that heat differed across sites within parks. We use heat index here, which is that combination term for air temperature and relative humidity. The hottest spot in the park reached 114 degrees heat index, and this is illustrated by an unshaded playground. That's that top right image. You can actually see the sensor, that white device on that blue part of the playground. And then just about 50 meters south of the hottest spot in the park was the coolest spot in the park, and that's the bottom right image, in a shaded part of the playground. From children wearing those elastic belts during their 20-minute on average recess period, we saw that as temperatures rise, children decreased their physical activity and they sought shade. And we see around 91 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the inflection point where children were less likely to be participating in physical activity and more likely to be in the shade. What we also found, and not shown in this image, is that at the school park with the most tree canopy, it was associated with children engaging in more moderate to vigorous physical activity, or MVPA. From those surveys, we found that children's psychological connection to nature had a significant positive association with their overall SEL skills, their self-awareness, their self-management, and their relationship skills. So what does this all mean? Well, based on these findings, we can suggest a few recommendations, both environmental interventions and programmatic interventions. So in terms of schoolyard design, we could green our schoolyards. We see that it's associated with quite a few benefits and may increase children's psychological connection to nature. We also recommend adding shade to areas intended for physical activity. So shading a playground, putting shade over your basketball courts. We also recommend adding shade to areas intended for rest because we don't expect children to be active the entire time they're at a park. And their caregivers or whoever's monitoring their play probably want a place to rest or to hang out that is comfortable. In terms of programmatic interventions, one idea is to schedule recess during more comfortable times of day. That seems like a no-brainer, but also has to be attuned to the scheduling of the school itself, because recess is serving as a mental and physical break for not only the children, but also for the teachers. And so that's not conducive to a mental break if it's the first thing in the morning, because we probably want them to have some curriculum before then. Organizing shaded play on the days with extreme heat. So That could be where an organized basketball game happens under a shaded structure rather than having children run around in other places of the park that could be too hot. Then there's this idea that why don't we just shift recess to indoor activity spaces on extreme heat days? We don't think this is necessarily ideal because schools are already overburdened in terms of how they use their indoor spaces. And children and adults already spend 90% of their time on average indoors. And outdoors, we know the air can be cleaner and there is greater chances for engaging in activity as well as potential connection with nature. So kind of the final thing I'm going to share today is just, can trees mitigate heat stress and improve safety on routes to and from school? So here are kids walking home under excessive heat. This was a news article from last year in Florida, just showcasing how hot it is. And that stroll becomes anything but leisurely. So this is an ongoing study funded by the National Institutes of Health, where we're looking at if planting trees along routes that children are walking to and from school can mitigate or lower temperatures. And so this is a way to manage heat. We did this across 78 elementary schools in Austin, and we focus on this 1 mile Euclidean buffer around each school. So the school itself is the center point, and then you have a 1 mile radius in any given direction to create that circle. And then where we planted trees, we focus on only those spaces adjacent to streets, sidewalks, and bike lanes, because that's where children and potentially their caregivers are walking to and from school. We measured heat stress using a model in a tool, a plug-in to a GIS system called Urban Multiscale Environmental Predictor, or UMEP. We were able to calculate these data at a 2-meter resolution hourly, and we used a heat stress metric called Universal Thermal Climate Index, which is relatively similar to that wet bulb globe temperature in that it measures air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, and radiation, but it's also combined with a physiological model that gets at what people are wearing, their physical activity level while they're doing so. And so it correlates with wet bulb globe temperature, but it's a bit different. And then we measured heat stress along the routes after tree planting by using a tool within UMEP, that is able to place trees in an area that we decide for it, and it places trees based on where it would maximize cooling. And so we planted 250 trees within each of these 1 mile school buffers. 250 came from talking with the city arborist as to what's a reasonable number. They also gave us specifications on the canopy size of the tree, as well as the height of the tree. And the potential planting area being public space that was pervious along the routes. So public was important because we wanted it to focus on what the municipality could do to mitigate heat, and then pervious being soil and these other spaces that were more conducive to planting instead of like ripping up concrete or something like that. And so then after we placed these trees, we then reran this model to calculate this Universal Thermal Climate Index. So here are the data across one of these 1 mile Euclidean buffers of a school where it's zoomed in. And what you can see on the right-hand image are where the trees were placed based on the model within the 1 mile buffer. And this black hashed area is the route to school. So this potential planting area, right? And you can see that it's kind of planted in clusters to maximize cooling. And then in the bottom left-hand image, you see the Universal Thermal Climate Index prior to the planting. So the red areas are the higher UTCI. In the top left, you see the chart of the different UTCI ranges and the different thresholds for different stress categories on humans. So you see there's about a 10-degree difference in UTCI from the hottest spot to the coolest spot in the left-hand image. And in the right-hand image, you see after the planting where there's been a reduction in heat stress. And so it's relatively hard to tell, but if you look where those trees are planted in the top right image, and then you look at the bottom right image, you can see some blue area that's been added. And so you see how it's hyper-localized the reduction in heat stress given from a given tree. And so now wrapping all this up, we've understood that while average temperatures are increasing globally due to climate change, cities are also warming due to this urban heat island effect. Extreme heat, it impacts everyone. It impacts their physical and mental health, both children and adults. Now, while everyone is impacted by extreme heat, certain populations, especially those who are economically disadvantaged, unfairly experience a greater health burden because they have constrained or unavailable resources to cope with these temperatures. But we know that there are some solutions. There are environmental policy interventions that can promote not only health, but safety and well-being in the face of both climate change and development patterns that are leading to higher temperatures through this urban heat island effect. And so all of this work, it's not done independent, it's done with a team, and it couldn't be done without these folks. And so I just want to highlight these individuals, both from academia, along with nonprofits, City of Austin. And thank you for your time today. I'm happy to answer any questions. And if you think of some later, please do reach out over email. Happy to talk. And look out in time for our lab website that'll be live soon called the Heat Lab, Health Equity Action Together. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lanza. Feel free to speak up if you have any questions or comments. While you were talking, I think I saw Katie Butterworth published an article from Houston Public Meeting. I think that was the one you were referring to, if I'm not mistaken. It's like a sweat box. Houston bus stops reach dangerous temperatures this summer.
That's exactly right. Good find. Who put that in the chat? It's been amazing working with. So Sarah Ernst and Katie Watkins were the two media reporters there. Both of them no longer work at that spot, but we are, as of tomorrow, I'm going to be submitting a research manuscript based on that work. And that is important because Houston is continuing to move forward with a bus stop shelter design that actually leads to higher heat stress levels under the shelter when it's unshaded. And so we want to make sure that these data can be peer reviewed and showcased, and we can have a conversation with the metro there.
This is so great. Thank you so much. I was just part of a heat mapping exercise here in Houston last weekend. And so important to get this data to guide investment and where we're going to do intervention. I wonder, do you know of any research on the mitigating effects of just proximate lower shrubbery? Like, I know we ideally like to have trees planted, and trees are amazing, and they're also real expensive to establish. And then now with our recent storms in Houston, there's all kinds of debate about vegetation management. And so I'm just wondering, like, I see heat imagery around, like large native grasses and that kind of stuff. And that too can mitigate ambient temperature, but I don't know how effective it is, like in a Houston environment with our high humidity. Like, I just wondered if you knew of anyone who was looking at that greening as an option short of full-on tree planting to help to mitigate.
Great question, Katie. And obviously you're on the pulse of like what's happening. This is cool. The trees offer a really important second dimension that a shrubbery, other types of vegetation wouldn't offer, shrubs and grasses, is it's that shading component. And that's a significant difference. So all types of vegetation offer evapotranspiration, that evaporation of water from plants' leaves that does lead to a cooling of the near surface air. Yet it also, as you mentioned, also leads to humidity levels from these any type of vegetation. So typically that canopy is able to offset and outpunt the increase in humidity from vegetation. But when you have just grass and shrubs, that's not going to have that benefit. With that said, I'm not canceling the idea of vegetation. We know that there are several co-benefits, so diversity support, stormwater management, which also gets at some flooding support, which you have to think about context, right? So in Houston, flash flooding, other types of flooding, that's a serious issue, especially with hurricanes increasing in frequency and intensity with climate change. And so you really just play to the context of your site. And so I would say the answer is most likely both. Let's have some lower level shrubs, grasses, as well as some, and let's focus on native species when possible, and then also have some tree canopy.
I see you have your hand, Dr. Perkison. Real quick, I'll get Nomita's. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Any information on the impact of heat on obesity, especially thinking about children?
Yes, thanks, Nomita. That's really, we try to get at that with the work we're doing through looking at the outcome of physical activity. I haven't looked at the outcome of obesity specifically, yet we know that physical activity is a health behavior that leads or can lead to obesity, right? So in terms of not getting sufficient levels, there's I think that isn't a logical next step. I don't think enough folks have looked at heat and obesity specifically and among children. So let's talk.
Dr. Perkison?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. It's always good to hear what you've been working on. Really enjoyed the talk. One aspect of climate change is the dynamic nature of it. It's always changing. You're trying to adjust, particularly like when you're investing in trees, which is a 20, 30, 40 year for the life of the tree. Have you worked with arborists, as far as trying to recommend what trees are going to be appropriate to plant, particularly like in the Austin area, which is an area that's going to be a certain amount of desertification, and what species should you plant? And then the other part is the humidity is also going to increase in a lot of areas. In most areas is moisture, and if that is taken into account in some of your mapping as to not what the humidity is today, but what it will be in 20 years.
Yep. Great, Brett. And obviously love hearing you. Thanks for joining the talk. Couple questions there. I guess the first one that I remember is what I've understood is looking at heat index, that combination term for air temperature and relative humidity, is that the air temperature reductions outpunt the humidity gains from having something like tree canopy in place. So it seems like a net benefit, but again, would caution in spaces that are extremely humid, if that's going to be really that supportive. In terms of tree species level, the cities have their recommended lists, and they have it for probably good reasons. A lot of it's about tree survivability, because we know in urban spaces, there's a lot of different types of stressors on these trees that lead to a shorter lifespan. They also do so with, quite a bit of different things in mind, right? Cost, who's going to maintain them, potentially sometimes what the client wants or the space wants. And so I think there has to be continued attention to specific tree species level benefits and rationale for selection, because some of these things are based on standards that I think need to be updated. I did a study that looked at how climate change increases in temperatures is potentially affecting natural tree species ranges, because as our temperatures increase, species that were typically adapted to a region are now becoming unadapted. So these plant hardiness zones, the average annual minimum temperature at which a tree can grow and thrive. And so what we saw is a northward shift in species with temperatures. And so that's another angle one can think about in terms of the species level of what to plant for urban heat management is a tree. And so I know with, there's a few trees in Austin already that I understand we're starting to utilize Mexican species of these given trees because of that, lower latitude, but because of that shifting hardiness zone, these make more sense than our classic native species. So really what is native is going to potentially be changing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Lavina? Okay, I'll move to Stefania or Stefania.
Yeah, good morning. I'm Stefania Tomaskovic, and it's really great to hear your talk today, Dr. Lanza. It was very informative. I work with a nonprofit, the Coalition for Environment Equity and Resilience. We have 27 member organizations, and one of our members is Link Houston. And I'm wondering if you have been in connection with Link, because they're doing a lot of really incredible work on bus stops here in Houston. And I know that adequate shading and cooling at bus stops is one of their areas of focus at the moment.
Thanks, Stefania. I haven't worked with Link before. I'd love to. I think there's a lot of great organizations doing important things. And based on that snippet you gave, it sounds like we're aligned on that. And I think what I'd really want to do with my work is create evidence for action. This isn't something that should just live in a manuscript somewhere. I think we really want to activate what we do. And the only way to really do so effectively is to partner with organizations that have that expertise. and get insight from community members and co-develop these solutions and then evaluate them and check in iteratively to make sure that this is actually what people want. So you saw that slide with the bus stop shelters and the new ones and how some folks were saying that's not us. And that's a learning opportunity, I think. So yes, I'd be happy if there's an opportunity to connect with Link if you happen to have that connection.
Yeah, great. You dropped your email, so I'd be happy to make an email introduction.
Right on. Thanks.
And there's also a comment in the chat from Melina that says, have you seen the new book by the Fed Reserve of New York and Local Initiative Support Corporation? It's called What's Possible? Investing Now for Prosperous, Sustainable Neighborhoods. And then thanks for including the web link in the downloadable book.
Oh, okay. I love this. I'm gonna download this book. That's exciting. No, I haven't read that book. I've done some work with New York. I was part of this New York State Climate Change Impacts Assessment. So I was one of the co-authors of its health and safety chapter. And yeah, but in terms, I'm assuming it's kind of a national look or maybe even international. So I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, it's fabulous. I've been reading, I just found it a week ago or so, and it mainly talks about what actions can corporations, government, and different initiatives, nonprofit organizations, what actions can they take to develop sustainable communities? And they talk about the importance of community developers and how they need to partner and how they can, create these sustainable communities based on the climate change.
It's on my
So
reading list now. Thank you.
really good tips. I can turn my camera off. I'm sorry. But no, it's a really good book. It's a little bit dry on the dry side because it's all, tips and problematic issues, but it's very insightful.
Okay. Insightful and dry.
Yes.
I was just curious. I know a lot of the heat-related issues that you're speaking of and that your research covers is within the communities, local communities. But have you looked at heat-related issues inside Texas prisons? I'm just curious. I know each legislative session there are bills that have not been passed in the Senate to get AC in Texas prisons. And through my advocacy work, I know that every summer, many people die in Texas prisons because there is no AC. And these are mostly nonviolent offenders, people who are not sentenced to death. So I'm just wondering if you looked into that or have you done any research about that? Or
Okay, gosh. I mean, that's a heavy topic. I think that's something that is unfortunately for the general person out of sight and out of mind, right? And these are humans being put in completely unfair conditions, right? Related to whatever given reason they're in that space. And so I know that folks have looked at that across the US. I don't recognize any studies that are out of Texas. I think that would be a relatively challenging data set to get one's hands on, right? In terms of both the temperature level. I guess the temperature would be relatively simple because we could just use a nearby weather station maintained by the National Weather Service.
They test they have inspections where they test the temperatures inside the units. And oftentimes they're 125 degrees in the cells. I've experienced that myself. I was lucky enough to survive that phase of my life, but I saw personally many people get carried out and it was because of heat, and that happens every summer. So I'm always very curious anytime there's heat related issues, and this is something that I personally invest in trying to get past. So I was just curious, but thank you.
Okay, good to know that there's actual temperature sensing as well in those locations. And then I think it's understanding what health outcomes we might have access to in terms of heat-related illness or, God forbid, mortality. And so this is something I'd love to support and work with you on. Or if you know someone who has, that conversation we could have, then I'd be happy to connect on it. Thank you.
All right. Well,
Thank
that
you. I'll follow up. Mhm.
it's always good to have a networking session with direct networking. All right. Well, then Mark, it's now 9:30. I want to thank everyone for attending. Of course, Dr. Lanza, thank you for taking the time to present this. We will post the recording on our YouTube channel for the Center for Health Equity. I just put it in the chat, so stay tuned for that. And again, thank you so much, and hope everyone has a good Thursday.
Thanks, Wes. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.